This is the Open Dialogue series on mass incarceration. We'll come back after spring break. We'll have a second event on immigration and the dangers of stereotyping immigrants. The Nigerian novelist Chidamanda Adichie once said, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story, and the consequence of the single story is it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, and it emphasizes how different we are rather than similar. While the United States is about 5% of the world population today, we incarcerate 20% of the world's prison population. Although black men in this country account for about 4.2% of the American population, we incarcerate about they make up about 42% of the US prison population. The United States clearly has a mass incarceration crisis, and we can debate about the different factors that adds to our mass incarceration crisis. And one of them is bias. Bias plays a huge role, and it's debatable about when bias comes in place and leads to this high numbers in our prisons. I hope you guys keep an open mind to our panelists as they explain how bias comes into play and create a prison pipeline along the way. Thanks.
Hi, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Nisitich, and I direct the honors program at the University of Southern Maine, across the street. And I was asked to come and help moderate this. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to question and answer or have a discussion about this topic. So thank you in advance for attending and eating our lunch and participating in this interesting topic. So our first speaker is Deanna Mills. She is a Maine Law graduate, class of 2016. Sort of. So you're class of 2017. And she, congratulations. Thanks. She is going to be speaking about some research that she did with Professor Northrup to study and identify links between implicit racial bias and preschool suspicion and expulsion. Deanna is going to be talking about her study, which discusses implicit bias generally, and also in the context of preschool teachers and administrators. The study also examines how early injustices set children on a course to prison and disenfranchisement.
Hi everyone, so I'm Tana. Most of you know me, most of you have heard me speak about implicit bias, so I won't spend a ton of time going over what implicit bias is. But very generally and broadly, implicit bias is people associating a certain individual with a negative stereotype. It's cognitive processing. We all do it. We walk down the street and we encounter hundreds of people, probably in Maine, not thousands like New York, but we encounter hundreds of people and we categorize them into boxes, right? Hashtagging them as Muslim or LGBT or tall or professional or homeless, right? So we all do it. It's cognitive processing. And it's not problematic until you start to associate that with a negative stereotype, right? So you're going to see that in terms of thinking that all black people are gang members or gangster rappers, right?
Can you speak into your mic a little bit closer? Sorry.
Sure, is that better, Nicole?
Yes.
And so associating with negative stereotypes is where it becomes problematic, because then you begin to categorize people based on those negative stereotypes. So that leads to this implicit bias. And being that it's not explicit, you don't necessarily know that you're doing it. So there's been a bunch of studies on it. The Harvard has a test called the IAT, or the implicit admissions test, and you can take it on a range of different areas. So gender fluidity, religion, race, whether women should be in liberal arts programs versus science programs. So you should go to Harvard's website and take it and check your bias. It's not perfect, but in the aggregate, it shows that everyone has a bias. whether it's racially motivated or religiously motivated or body type motivated. Everyone has one. It's not bad. It's only bad when you start to push that on people and use it to treat people certain ways. So that's implicit bias very generally and quickly. So the study that, the research that I did with Professor Northrup and Professor Wilshusen over the last year has been about the preschool to prison pipeline. So that sounds dramatic, right? So preschoolers going to prison. But what it is kids as early as ages 3 and 4 are being disproportionately suspended and expelled from school based on their racial background. Right, so I have some numbers. They're going to sound terrible, but I'm going to tell you anyway. In the 1970s, fewer than 4% of students were expelled or suspended nationwide. We saw an uptick in suspensions in 1994 when the no guns, no weapons policies came into play in schools. And then again, we saw it when zero tolerance policies came into play. So zero tolerance policies are one and done, right? If you get in a fight, you're suspended, no questions asked, and that's it. And then we started seeing the rise of school resource officers, which are police in schools. And that was done between 97 and 2007 to prevent mass shootings, right? Like Columbine, things like that. But then what we started seeing was schools using school resource officers to enforce law and policy in the school, right? So in 2011, 2012, 92,000 students were arrested in their schools. That's data that's 5 years old. And schools that have school resource officers have 5 times more arrests than schools without school resource officers. So we could debate whether school resource officers need to be trained specifically to deal with children and what their role is in the school, but that definitely contributes to kind of kicking kids into the juvenile justice system. I think the role for school resource officers is unclear because they are working in their capacity as a police officer, but they're also working in their capacity as an administrator for the school. And so they are enforcing law and policy, which I think can maybe be problematic when you see school resource officers as early as elementary school and kids as young as 8 and 9 being arrested for assault, disorderly conduct, and things like that. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into why it's important in Maine because we all live here. And so what we're seeing in Maine, everyone knows that Maine is a predominantly white state. So the most recent numbers I found this morning, Maine is 96.9% white, 0.5% Black or African American, 0.6% Native or First Peoples, 0.7% Asian, and 1% 2 or more races. And the juvenile prison population, so Long Creek Development Center here in Maine, Chris was gracious enough to get me those numbers. And in the third quarter of 2016, 43 of the kids in Maine, in Long Creek were white and 13 were of color, which makes them a third of our juvenile prison population and less than 1% of the general population. So I think the numbers kind of speak for themselves. I don't think there need much explanation. Obviously, we can talk about whether race is the only contributing factor, which I don't think it is, but this is focusing particularly on bias. So I will turn it over.
Thank you, Deanna. Our next speaker is Professor Thea Johnson. Professor Johnson studies the institutional roles of public defender and prosecutor. Prior to joining Maine Law, Professor Johnson was a public defender with both the Federal Defenders of New York and the Criminal Defense Division of the Legal Aid Society, also in New York City. Thank you.
I'm going to do something that I criticize other people for, but I'm going to tell you about a snippet of Radio Lab that I heard and then got out of the car, and so didn't hear the rest of the episode. So I might be totally wrong about what they ended up saying. But the snippet I heard last week when I was driving to work and thought about today was that they did a study and when they showed people the same exact scenario, some scenario involving a guy named Joe, and in some cases the people had a cup of warm coffee, a hot cup of coffee, and in some cases they had iced coffee. And the people who had warm coffee liked Joe more. They had warmer feelings towards Joe. And they did this over and over again and sort of found that if you're holding a hot cup of coffee, you're more likely to be positive towards things that are going on around you. You feel more warmth. And the reaction to that I had, and I'm sure if other people heard it, is like, oh, that's kind of a weird thing our brain does. Like, that's interesting. And for something like that doesn't sort of make us question our sort of fundamental principles. And yet, our brain does something too when we think about implicit bias, right? When we see certain people, when we see certain experiences, we fill in a narrative. That's also just a weird, neat thing our brain does, except sometimes it operates to the detriment of society, right? One of the things that I've looked at in my research about public defenders and prosecutors is the role of implicit bias. And a few years ago, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office enlisted the Vera Institute of Justice to study the life of a case as it moved its way through prosecution and see whether or not race was a factor in making decisions about a particular case. And I give them full credit, actually, these two offices, that they opened their doors to Vera to do this study. And indeed, Vera found that there was bias functioning, right? That race was a factor in all phases, right? That it was a factor in all phases. The ones that they found were sort of the big areas is that if you were more likely, if you're Black or Hispanic, to be held in on bail, for bail to be set. So what does that mean? That means you're not out pending the trial, participating in your own defense, and you are more likely to get a jail or prison offer rather than a non-jail prison offer if you're Black or Hispanic. And this was particularly true in drug crimes, that Black and Hispanic defendants fare dramatically worse when it comes to drug offenses than white and Asian defendants. And those were the four groups they were looking at. So what sort of, there's a lot of things that are interesting about this, but one of the things is that they were looking at the life of one particular case. But think about if it starts when you're in preschool, and it continues, and by the way, we're not talking about a lot, but it continues to the decision to make arrests, right? Then the decision as to whether to prosecute, what kind of bail will be set, what kind of offer will be made. All those things have, you keep getting a worse deal each time, right? A new decision is made in which you get the disadvantage of that implicit bias, right? So if indeed you're sitting in jail, the chances that you will get a worse offer go dramatically up, right? Because they know they've got you, right? You want to get out of jail. And so I want to just tell a quick anecdote, which if you are a student of mine, you know I like to do that. That I think demonstrates where this comes up, right? And I think there's a lot of importance in numbers, but sometimes anecdotes can get these things across. I, one time, was representing a 16-year-old girl who was charged with misdemeanor shoplifting. She'd gone into Sephora, she'd stolen some makeup, quite a bit of makeup, and they would not, she had no record, no criminal record, and they would not come down off of asking her to plead guilty to a misdemeanor shoplift. Now that's actually quite significant, right? To have a criminal record as a 16-year-old when you've never had a criminal record. And I can tell you also that once you have a criminal record, that changes anytime you enter the criminal justice system again. It changes what sorts of offers you're going to get. And so, I couldn't sort of understand what was going on here. Why would they come down off this offer? And so I brought the 16-year-old client into the district attorney's office for something that we call in New York as a queen for a day, where she basically pleads her case. She says, look, I really, here's what you should give me. What we wanted was a non-criminal disposition. And during this Queen for a Day conversation, the prosecutor said to her, well, were you acting alone or were you acting with others? And she said, I was acting alone. I mean, I was there by myself. And the prosecutor turns on a video and says, let's go to the video. And there's, a video of my client in Sephora. And don't shoplift because there are videos everywhere. That's what my piece of legal advice to you. And there's a video, and at some point in the video, another woman approaches my client and hands her makeup and has a conversation with her, and the prosecutor says, there. And I should mention my client's black 16-year-old girl, no criminal record. Another black woman enters the frame and they have a conversation. She says, there, what are you doing with that woman? Well, it's very clear that the woman is an employee of Sephora. She's wearing black. She has on a name tag. But what happened is somehow when that prosecutor was watching that video, she would tell you if you asked her separately, when you see a black person, do you see criminality? And she would say, no, I don't see that. And I think she would say that to you with honesty. She would legitimately feel that way. But when she was watching that video, she saw two black people having a conversation, and somehow her brain shut down in terms of other facts, other glaring, it wasn't a great video, but it was a pretty clear video. She didn't see the name tag. She didn't see the uniform, that if you go into any Sephora, you recognize this uniform. And, the client and I are sitting there, and the client says, that's an employee of the store, and this DA kind of, what she should have said is, oh my God, I am so sorry, I can't believe I did that. Instead she goes, oh, okay. And she ended up, after this meeting, giving the client what we wanted. But imagine if we hadn't gone in and watched that video, right? The client would have gotten a criminal record. That would have changed all sorts of outcomes in the future for her. If you're in my Crim Pro class, and all sorts of collateral consequences. And really, what was the function there? The function was the prosecutor saw a scene and she read in a narrative. She read in a narrative based on bias that I legitimately don't think she sort of has consciously, but unconsciously, she read in a narrative of criminality of two black women speaking to each other. And that could have had a devastating impact for my client. And in this case, it had, somewhat less devastating, but think about the next case, right? That prosecutor continues to prosecute cases. So, I think the thing I really want to leave you with is this idea that race does factor into these decisions. That Vera, which is incredibly well respected, has done these studies, but I also want you to think about the way in which, okay, so if that, it factors into this decision, and then what does this decision mean for the next decision? What does the next decision mean for the decision after that, right? That with each disadvantage, you become increasingly more disadvantaged, and implicit bias is functioning in these ways, in ways that people are really not, at all kind of in touch with. Thanks.
And our last speaker is Jerome Bennett. Jerome has just accepted a new role, and so I will introduce his current or brand new title and also his former title. So Jerome has been the disproportionate minority contact coordinator for the Department of Corrections, and he has just accepted a role as the policy and technical assistance coordinator with the Opportunity Alliance. In both of these roles, Jerome has done juvenile system reform work, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, before I jump into things, this is actually a pretty good roadmap to understand how implicit bias can manifest. We're exposed to negative symbolic attitudes, and this is by the Kirwan Institute. So we're exposed to negative symbolic attitudes, and through classical conditioning, so you're exposed to a stimulus like time and time again, and when we talk about implicit bias, contributing factors to implicit bias is our background, is our experiences, media portrayals. All of these things creates impressions in our brain that we tap into unconsciously that adds a list of adjectives around white being adequate and not white is not adequate. And so that's just the premise. And so we form implicit racial bias, and that leads to prejudice and racial stereotyping. So now we're acting on those unconscious beliefs and attitudes, and that leads to discrimination, and discrimination leads to racial inequality and injustice. And so that's how it kind of manifests from being kind of psychological to actually impacting outcomes. So as DMC coordinator, implicit bias trainings, and one of the things that I do is implicit bias trainings, and the reason I focused on that is because a lot of youth and families felt like they were being treated unfairly across systems, so not just in the juvenile justice system. And I'd like to actually look at this through a mental health lens, because multi-generational trauma is real, and if you're dealing with minority populations, like I don't have to do a history lesson, and we're all here because of the movie 13, so that highlights a lot of the barriers that populations of color has faced here in the U.S. And then when you look at immigrant refugees and asylum seekers, they're coming here for safety and security, and they're escaping genocide and a lot of just real life situation that has effects on the way that you learn, your behavior, your thoughts. It affects the way that you go about engaging in personal relationships. You might have, you might not trust someone as readily as someone who grew up in a safe environment. I say that to say this. Maine has one of the highest poverty rates, and this was from last year's stats, amongst people of color. And when you're dealing with impoverished communities, you see things at face value, so you're exposed to violence, substance abuse, sex trafficking. So I work with a lot of kids that are dealing with adult issues and adult problems, and at the same time they're trying to discover themselves and their identity, and they have to make split-second decisions because they're in the tyranny of the moment, and we have a lot of our systems focus on behavior and are punitive because of the behavior that they see when there's really underlying issues. So there's a lot of research coming out around trauma and adverse childhood experiences. They refer to it as ACEs. And the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to engage in certain risk factors, like aggression, or there's mental health consequences around depression, prostitution, like anything negative. If you have more ACEs, you're more susceptible to, or you're higher risk at engaging in those types of behaviors, and that's because there's a lot of triggers in the system that aren't really conducive to building a safe environment so that people can grow, develop, and discover who they are. So when I'm working with a young person, and we're putting young people through a continuum of care. So there's a bunch of systems all doing work, everybody's in correspondence with each other, and there's a lot of subjectivity that happens, and that's really where these biases really manifest. So you might have a kid that's depressed, and on top of that, you might have a cultural disconnect because, all of the JCCOs may be white, or all of the DA, or you go into the courtroom and everybody's white, and implicit bias goes both ways. So, that historical context, or that historical trauma creates triggers and causes people to shut down, but a young person may be feeling depressed and feeling recluse, and people might interpret that as being, oh, that person just doesn't care, or he or she just isn't engaged. And so what happens is when you make those types of impressions, and you're passing a kid down a continuum of care, and that next thing you know, they're in residential placement and they're reading reports and they read about a kid just not caring or being checked out or having aggression issues or labeling them as a thug. Like, that just makes it less likely for where if that kids get triggered in that new setting, it makes it less likely that they're going to get a second opportunity and a second chance. And when we have systems filled with triggers, then we need a way to kind of de-escalate the situation. A lot of the kids of color in Maine that get caught up in the system are in there due to personal offenses. And so we really need to find interventions that can help mitigate some of these interpersonal dynamics to support them as they navigate systems, and we have a compounding factor of like judgments being made that takes away from that safety and security. I guess another example, kids get, and like the thugs and the gangs are a big reoccurring thing. And it affects outcomes because no matter, in some instances, like in Long Creek, a young person can be behaving well and de-escalating and being a positive influence on their peers, but if they have that label of being a thug and a gang leader, then all of that good work that they're doing is, they're only doing that work because they have power with their peers, and their peers, they have street credit, and so even though they're being an actual role model, it's seen in that negative light, and that may affect the unit that you're in, so you might be placed in a unit with more restrictions. We all know that health disparities exist, so when kids are on probation process and essentially under a magnifying glass for years, if they have natural supports close to them that have passed, knowing what we know about trauma, sometimes they shut down, and we need to have policies and practices that can kind of support that dynamic, because what has happened is that if a kid's natural support is sick or dying, then they may not be in a mental space to meet their clinical team and meet their wraparound team, and they may want to say, hey, like, I'm in the hospital, can we reschedule these meetings? But after you reschedule, 2-3 meetings, there's a lot of anxiety around that, and at the end of the day, policy says you have to notify the facility, the juvenile detention center, and a warrant goes out for your arrest. So all things aside, you have people that are dealing with trauma of their loved ones being sick and ill, which happens at a higher rate for people of color, and we don't really have an infrastructure in place to support them through that. And if you have email correspondence, like, oh, well, can we meet tomorrow or can we meet Thursday? To that young person, that comes off as harassment because they need that space to kind of get their thoughts together. And I know, like, if my mom was sick, like, I can take professional leave, but there's a different requirement that we're putting on young people in dealing with these situations. So I'm just trying to provide the context of how implicit bias and these judgments and narratives actually affects the outcomes and affects the types of interventions that we may offer a young person who's going through this continuum of care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm now going to open it up to the audience and see if anyone has any questions or comments.
So I have a question to Taya and then separately a question to Deanna and Jerome. And it relates to sort of the subtitle of the event today on the screen behind you about evidence of systemic racial animus. And so I'm familiar with the Bear Institute, and I worked with them years ago on the Bale study, but is there any study that's been done about how defendants are treated when it comes to sentencing? If you have a white defendant and a defendant of color in front of the judge on the same offense, do they get different sentences? And then the question to Deanna and Jerome would be, do we have any evidence or statistics or studies in Maine comparable to the Vera studies that have been going on in New York and elsewhere of how people, defendants in the system, the criminal system, from bail all the way up to sentencing and then incarceration, how that statistically breaks down?
So I know that the Vera Institute did cover that question in their study of, at least in their study of Manhattan. So in front of me I have the black defendants were 27% more likely than white defendants to receive jail or prison time for misdemeanor drug offenses. Hispanic defendants were 18% more likely to be incarcerated for those crimes. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in terms of generally non-drug crimes, but they did find that. And so what's interesting about that, of course, is that's both prosecutors but also judges, right? So both are playing a role in sentencing. Largely prosecutors, right? Because prosecutors are generally negotiating pleas with a particular sentence. But judges certainly are willing to play too. But beyond that, I have to imagine there has been, and now, I mean, encouraged to go look and see. But Vera did cover that, yeah.
So I know that the disproportionate minority contract report that was put out by the Muskie School most recently in 2015 addressed some of that, and some of the numbers I wrote down quickly were Black and African American youth are arrested at 3 times the rate of their white peers. They're diverted less than half the rate of their white peers. They're detained by police at least 1.7 times as often as their white peers. Detention in Long Creek is about 2.25 times more than their white peers, and then commitment is 2 times the rate of their white peers. The DMC specifically focused on about 15 points of contact through the criminal justice system. So from their very first initial contact with a police officer to their JCCO to dispositional conferences with the juvenile prosecutor and all the way up until their commitment. So that report is the most recent one that I know of. I know that they work on them sporadically, but that's the most recent data.
And just to add That report is, it was released in 2015. It's from, but the data collected is from between 2009 and 2012. And according to the report, there's no disparities in the court, in the courtroom. Well, there's no disproportionality in the courtroom. A dynamic that I see a lot with the kids that I work with is our pleas, where they don't feel like they'll get a fair shot if they were to go to court, and they would rather take the plea because the alternatives are a little bit more punitive, and they're just trying to move on. So that's a regular dynamic that I see.
Professor
So, I have a question for Deanna, right?
Yes.
The numbers that you gave in terms of, I think it was 43 whites at Long Creek
Yes.
and 13 persons of color, or
Yes. Persons, youth of color.
youth of color? Are they, the first question that came to my mind was those location, what does place or location, what impact is that, is there? Because if a third of these minority youths that are in Lang Creek, where do they come from? Are they primarily from southern Maine? Because if the majority of the people of color population lives in southern Maine, that number might not be as significant in the totality. If, let's say, 90% of the persons of color in Maine lives in southern Maine, and the majority of those students are those youth of color that are there come from southern Maine, does that affect how we look at the number?
I think it can. I know that the disproportionate minority contact report can measure that in 5 of the 6 counties in Maine. So there are some counties where it can't be measured at all because there's not a significant enough minority population to measure it. In terms of where specifically the youth of color that are incarcerated at Long Creek are coming from, I don't know that. I don't know if it's Androscoggin County versus York County. I don't know those numbers.
Androscoggin and Cumberland County and York area.
And do you have any idea on the variation of, or what does the population going to look like in Androscoggin versus Cumberland County? And if the majority of those that are there, let's say the supermajority is from Cumberland County, but the supermajority of minority people are living in Cumberland County, what does that tell us? Is it really disproportionate? So,
and I just want to make it, to distinguish, so we use relative rate index. That's when we say, like, for every 2 black people that get arrested, 1 white person gets arrested. And the numbers are low, so the low numbers can skew that relative rate index where a few kids can't influence that index. That's a data problem. That's not a disparity issue. And so there's a lot of confusion around the fact that we have a data problem, that disparities don't exist. And so it takes further investigation to kind of dig down and identify what those disparities are. And what was this other part of your question? Does that answer a part of your question?
Yeah, that's what I said. Can I have one follow-up? Just real quick. Jerome, I think in your presentation you talked about Long Creek, and I'm thinking about Missouri, a state that had since the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th century, had 3 large institutions in rural communities where they shipped hundreds of juvenile or wayward youth. And by about 1983, they basically moved away from that to community-based initiatives, where they have community-based centers where these affected youths will remain close to home. And it has now become a leader in the nation in terms of how you deal with youth that has problems. And I wonder how Maine relate to what's going on in Missouri, because I know when I was at the University of Missouri, there was so many states that came to Missouri to see how are you dealing with having so much success with this community-based initiative. Is there any discussion in Maine about doing something similar?
Yes, to the state's credit, there's definitely discussions and an understanding of the value of community-based interventions. The problem with going down that road is that things have to look a very particular way, and for community-based initiatives to be effective, and that's where the education and that's where the education needs to happen when the state and other, because it's happening in partnership with the communities. That's the conversation that they need to have as we develop effective strategies so that the communities, kids can go back home to their communities and develop those support mechanisms locally. So there is a lot of talk around local-based interventions. I guess that's all I could really say to that right now. But even in terms of like, you know, figuring out even in terms of like local-based residential treatment facilities, you know, just to keep kids in a community, and for those facilities to have meaningful partnerships with community organizations so that those kids are supported in those systems as they face disparities, and using that dynamic to develop a feedback loop around people's experiences, so that we can refine the policies and practices. Because you know, when we talk about implicit bias, like here we are, we developed a mental health system, juvenile justice system, a social services, like everything is developed in accordance to white norms. And so anything that stands out from the norm, or anything that isn't the norm, stands out. And when we have these implicit undertones, and you stand out, you're more vulnerable, you know. So, and that's why, you know, mentorship programs are huge, peer support, and that needs to be done by the community and community leaders, because we need to pass. There are certain, life looks a certain way when you're a person of color, and our leaders and community members need to develop an infrastructure to pass those skills down to young people so that they can successfully navigate the system and be better protected.
This question's for Mr. Bennett. With your new role in developing, I'm assuming developing policy, what positive changes are you wanting to implement? Because part of what you're talking about was how the policies are inherently can cause difficulty for people of color in terms of, you know, how they're set up, and how do you plan, like, what have you decided to do and how are you going to implement that?
I love that question. And so when you're dealing with marginalized populations, relationships are important, which is why a lot of systems use relationship-based models. But what happens is that you can't practice relationship-based models and have your policies not reflect relationship-based values. So that's what happened, like in a situation that I was speaking to earlier, where a young person, natural support, was sick, and at the end of the day, a warrant goes out for the arrest. So you know, you're kind of living that hypocrisy. So you need complete buy-in from the system, and you have to find a way to embed youth and family voice that are going through those systems into that system, and develop a feedback loop of that for that information. So as we train systems, we're using experiences and challenges that people are experiencing that are actually going through that particular system, And so, you know, that's a part of an equity strategy. And with Opportunity Alliance, I'm actually able to employ an equity strategy because those closest to the problems are closest to the solution. And so for me, I'm dealing with young people, and so it looks a certain way. But at the end of the day, I'm bringing those experiences and those needs to the attention of whatever system we aim to support. You know, like people talk about reform, but it's just support, and the business of people is hard, and so like I don't envy like juvenile correction officers because like they have to be experts around so many things, and so it's not a matter of like, you know, coming at people and being punitive and judging them for these disparities existing. It's kind of lowering our defenses and having conversations so that we can figure out what types of community partnerships we can make to better support young people that are going through those systems and developing that capacity in the community to be able to even communicate effectively to the mental health systems, to the juvenile justice systems. And that's why part of my work when it comes to, you know, race is racial equity, you know, and the other part is employing equity strategies to refine that policies and practices.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you. If we're quick, maybe we can get going.
Yeah, keep it quick. Hey, thank you. So I have a question. Grew up in Southern Maine, in a poor area, and I saw the inequity that everyone's talking about. You know, it started at a pretty young age, and it starts in preschool time with people that come in and, you know, they've been in abusive homes or, so I just want, that's kind of the background idea, but I got to work in mental health for the past few years, and I got to see kind of how the state reacts to things, how the school reacts to things. And usually it hinges upon crisis, and that is the action point for everyone involved. And usually and that's the point that the police come in as well. And there's no going back from that because the law is the way it is. It seems to be a problem to increase the amount of services available to individuals because of price, because of the logistics, because of the policies, because you can't, it's very difficult to do so based off of the level of income or the level of poverty. But that seems to be how, at least in Maine, that problems arise, is that they happen in poor communities. They happen in places where people don't have access to these services. So is there any way to lower that bar from crisis down to a lower level when you notice a student is in need? Right now there's no dialogue really between students unless they show symptoms of ACEs. And those, it's not like going to a doctor. You know, it's not like that gets better after you treat it. It takes a long time. It takes a consistent approach. I was just wondering if you guys had any insight on how, you know, we have this justice system which affects behavior, and that's all negative punishment, or it could be negative reinforcement. But is there a way to positively reinforce people, you know, within the judicial system, or because that's really the only way that I can see us getting out of this issue of mass incarceration. It's a generational thing, obviously, and the racism problem needs to be addressed every time that it comes up, and it's going to be a long time before, you know, it's not as big of an issue. But is there any type of positive reinforcement strategies you can think of that we could enable people to seek services more adequately so they don't end up in the system?
That was big.
Sorry.
I'll say this very quickly, and then I think that you guys actually are better to answer this. But I actually think that one positive reinforcement strategy that we don't think about enough is just no state intervention, right? So that when we think about, if you read the article in the New Yorker about Milwaukee after they did the Vera study, their approach, which makes sense, is to divert people into programming, right? Don't put them in jail, put them in programming. And I think we have to remember that programming is also the state being involved in your life, and you not having control of your own life because the state is telling you what to do, and they, you know, so although I support putting someone on probation rather than putting them in prison, probation is not some answer to sort of like restarting communities, right, or something like that. So, you know, it's kind of a separate thing, but I often think that one thing that's overlooked is just after crisis, don't have a long-term relationship with a community or a person, unless it's absolutely necessary. And that's probably where I disagree with people, where it becomes absolutely necessary.
Do you think that that negative action inherently is not quantifiable, and therefore people won't talk about that?
What negative action? Oh, you mean like just state involvement?
Yeah.
I think it's quantifiable, but I think that people think of programming as a solution rather than the absence of, right, anything. Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What she said. I don't think state intervention helps. I think schools understanding that zero tolerance policies, especially with kids who are coming from trauma, coming from communities of poverty, and the whole host of like life that actually happens outside the education system, and being cognizant of that and culturally competent in who your students are and what their needs are before you say like, oh, you're disruptive, you've been suspended. I think that
Every school has a resource officer, but not every school has a psychologist.
right, and I think school resource officers in schools enforcing law and policy is a completely different, larger problem.
All right, so, does that come out? No, so, I just wanted to say a great thank
Do
you.
you have time for me to?
Oh, sorry.
Just real quick, I'll be quick. I like that question as well. So racial, that's why I focus on advancing racial equity. And the best thing that the system can do is employ equity strategies to empower communities to build their own capacity to resolve these issues. And in my opinion, that's literally the only thing that the system can do. But that's a big goal, and that can happen. But that takes a lot of education. Everyone needs to be on the same page and understand how that equity strategy looks. And with the kids that I work with, and when you're dealing with cultures, like some people may not even, like for me, like I have PTSD, and some people will call it hallucinations, but for me, it's like I believe in ghosts, you know? And so with different cultures and different populations, there's different beliefs, so you might not even think that you might not even put yourself in that box saying, I need mental health services. Or, you know, you might be exploring your sexual identity, and you definitely, you know, in populations where that's not accepted, you know, you're not going to utilize LGBTQ services, you know. It's up to the community members to figure out how to build capacity to do that, but they're under-resourced, underfunded, overlooked, not heard, and, you know, this, that, and the other. And so the kids that I work with, it's important that they're in the business of building their community and building that infrastructure, and with the right types of engagement, they can be leaders in that movement. And that's a whole workforce that we're undermining due to implicit bias. You know, we have a structure for everything else, but we're not willing to invest in that much needed structure that complements everything that systems are doing, you know. So I see a lot of system players actually, you know, working hard and working overtime and stepping out of their comfort zone to better accommodate, but there's this, that's only half of it, and we're missing the other half just entirely.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone on panel. I think the bottom line is, as I said at the beginning, there are different factors that's led to where we are right now in this country. And to dismiss bias as one of them is doing ourselves a huge disservice. From preschool to the kind of due you get at the prosecutor's office and the kind of rehabilitation you get when you get incarcerated, they add up. And I think that is the bottom line, that we have to be aware of our biases, regardless of what role we play in the system. And I think as we go away from today's event, as the only public law school in Maine, we have a responsibility, I think, to be able to be aware of our biases, that wherever we end up in the system, that we see, when we are aware of our biases, that we see it as a tool to reduce or be part of the struggle to reduce the number of people in prisons in the United States, as opposed to see it as an embarrassing factor when you understand you do have those biases. It's not an embarrassment if you know you have a bias. I think it's a way to improve on yourself and be part of the movement to reduce. I think this is a huge issue in the United States, and going forward, I think it's going to be one of those things as a generation we have to fix, because this is not sustainable. So I just want to thank everyone for coming and thank the panel, and thank you.